Is overpopulation hurting the planet? Today I talk with Pierre Desrochers and Joanna Szurmak. Welcome to The Curious Task from the Institute for Liberal Studies, where we explore economics, politics, philosophy, and other ideas from a classical liberal perspective. I'm Alex Aragona, your host, and today our guests are Pierre Desrochers and Joanna Szurmak. Pierre is an associate professor of geography at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. His main research interests are economic development, technical innovation, business environment interface, and energy policy and food policy. Joanna is a doctoral student at York University's Department of Science and Technology Studies. She is also a research services librarian at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, where she works with the psychology and anthropology departments and the robotics program. They've worked on a lot of projects together, but one of their books in particular that will inform a lot of our discussion today is Population Bombed, which they say destroys the link between overpopulation and climate change. Pierre and Joanna, welcome to the podcast today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So Joanna, Pierre, in each episode we start with a question and go wherever the discussion leads us. So I'll throw it right over to you guys. Is overpopulation hurting the planet?
No, it isn't, but it is very counterintuitive. And unfortunately, well, let me rephrase that. Every generation for the last 200 years, you've had a number of intellectuals, policymakers, and just members of the general public who have really worried about humanity's increasing numbers. And every generation, it turns out that the pessimists are wrong, that in a market economy, at least, this isn't true necessarily for communist economies, but in market economies, it turns out that people are not just mouths to feed, but they're also hands to works and brains to take up of new solutions. But despite 200 years of evidence to the contrary, a lot of people view overpopulation as a major problem.
Well, and I think it has to do with the fact that what we see here and what we actually documented in the book is a clash between two major intellectual discourses or perspectives. So Pierre already talked about the perspective of the pessimists or the Malthusians with their particular assumptions. So this idea that population, especially higher population or overpopulation, is utterly destroying the planet is one of the key arguments in the pessimist Malthusian or neo-Malthusian discourse. And one of the underlying assumptions there is the fact that people behave essentially like any other biological agent, be it bacteria, cattle, or any other creature that will breed or populate whatever area it's in, using up all of the natural resources. And at that point, once it's used up whatever's available, it'll have a huge population crash. That's it. Population, essentially, it's what Paul Ehrlich describes in the Population Bomb, the 1968 book, after which our book is named. Well, in the debunking of, our book is named. So the population crash would essentially be what everybody is expecting. So a growing population is supposed to result in that. Now, the other discourse, the optimist or cornucopia, and there are other names, right? I mean, what's
techno-optimist?
Yes, okay. Yeah, that's another good name for that. So the other discourse looks at people as not just consumers and let's say users of resources, but in fact producers. And what Pierre just told you is that with one of the views there is that with every mouth comes a brain and a pair of hands. So that translates into creating resources. And there is a fantastic quote that we use in our book towards the end of our book from Ted Nordhaus, actually, from an essay that he published in 2018, where he said that this whole idea of carrying capacity and fixed limits really doesn't exist when you consider people as these agents of productivity. Nordhaus says it took 6 times as much farmland to feed a single person 9,000 years ago at the dawn of the Neolithic age than it does today. So does carrying capacity matter? Well, it depends again on which perspective you're using.
So you mentioned on the one side of the debate, we have pessimists and optimists. So is it fair to say that the optimists essentially view progress when it comes to technology, and especially the growth of the population, as a good thing? It's something that the Earth can handle, and that the pessimists basically say the Earth can't handle this. At some point, we'll end up at a level where there is overpopulation, there's a finite set of space, etc. Is that too much of a simplification, or is that pretty much the divide?
No, it's not. No, what you need to understand is that historically, technological optimists came in two variety. You had the market optimist, who believed that people look for increased profitability, they respond to price signals, and so if something is missing, then the price of a resource will go out, it will go up, so people will look for more of it, they will use it more efficiently, and they will develop substitutes. And so you could call them the market or the free market optimist, but since they honestly believed in technological change. But also historically, communists, traditional Marxists also believed in technological progress and did not believe in carrying capacity, but their favorite approach was obviously central planning. But it is true that whether they were Marxists or whether they were free market economists, optimists recognize that one thing that sets humanity apart from other animal species is our capacity to invent new things. And because we invent new things by combining existing technologies in new ways, there is virtually no limit to the amount of new technologies that we can create. The problem, of course, turned out to be in communist economy that central planning for incentive issues, for the knowledge problem, which your podcast title refers to, obviously technological innovation came to a halt in centrally planned economies. Whereas the pessimists, and they're often biologists, are unwilling to acknowledge that humans differ from other animal species in this respect. So, for example, beavers will combine mud and logs to create dams, but that's all they combine, really. Termites will combine dust with their salivas to create structure or other things, but that's pretty much all that they recombine. But the reason why humanity ended up at the top of the food chain was because of our capacity to create new technology. But what overpopulation theorists will tell you is that, yeah, okay, maybe it was true in the past, but it is too risky, and we cannot be too optimistic that way. So controlling population numbers is actually a more rational thing to do than hope that, technological change will fall from like manna from heaven.
And absolutely, let's say that the climate crisis of today is not the first by any means of the scenarios that pessimists have invoked overpopulation to, or in order to control. We can go back to even in the beginning of the last century, the erosion problem. Then it was global cooling. Then it was global warming. Now, of course, it's climate crisis/chaos. Before that, when Malthus started out, he was simply trying to, in the simplest, let's say, the most simplified version of his views, trying to say that human population can grow exponentially, whereas the foodstuffs available to people appear to grow geometrically. Now, the interesting thing is, as Pierre mentioned, from the Marxist or early Marxist writings, Engels responded to that by saying, "No, wait a minute. Ideas grow geometrically too. Hence, they will always overtake this apparent depletion of material goods by increasing the capacity to produce more, again, exponentially."
So the pessimist thinkers, if you talk to them, probably would say that they do understand economic growth and innovation, and they do understand technological progress, but ultimately it won't help the population problem. So in your views, do you think they actually truly understand technological innovation and human progress and how it helps with the population issue and population growth? Or are they essentially just saying, yeah, we understand that and putting it aside, but they really don't?
No, they don't. And I don't want to go too technical here, but the issue is whether or not you believe in increasing returns to scale. So
well, let's go into it a bit, though, for sure.
Okay, so Malthus is usually described as Joanna was saying, to have said that food production will never be able to keep up with people. But beginning with later edition of his book, his key argument really became the notion that, well, whether we're talking about mineral resources or the land to grow food, humans will always skim the cream first. And so as you try to produce more food and you bring under cultivation land of lesser quality, or as you try to produce coal and you begin to exploit deposits that are less concentrated or of lesser values than the original one, you won't be able to keep up the amount of output that you need to feed or to clothe or to provide infrastructure for a growing population. And so while they believe in a certain level of technological change, the argument is always either that we will not be able to maintain, the past really does not provide a valuable guide to the future, because in the past, well, people had better lands to cultivate or they had better deposit to exploit. And so as you move down let's say, the quality ladder of the resources that you have, you'll have to spend more money and you will cause more environmental damage. And so because of the nature of these inputs, technological change won't be able to keep up. Whereas people who were critical of that said, no, it doesn't matter. Ultimately, we'll always be able, even if we bring lesser land under cultivation, we will develop better seeds, we'll have better fertilizers, we can irrigate the soil, we can concentrate certain types of production in certain regions. And I would say that, and Joanna might contradict me on this, the pessimists will often pay lip service to technological change, but then they will always say, well, but we cannot use the past as a useful guideline or way to think about the future because now things are different.
Well, actually, not so much contradiction. I want you to help me with this because I'm going to be going into something that we didn't really, we did address it in the book, but not exactly the way that Alex has posed as a question. Now, the thing is, Alex, that I think the type of technological change and the technological outcomes that we are producing through the development process that is the problem. So it's not just that there is technological change and that we have certain kinds of technologies. You see that a lot of the technological, let's say, outputs or products that we have been classified by various generations of environmental and sustainability thinkers as undesirable because of either the byproducts or the actual output. So over the years, people like Bill Rees and others have come up with not just theoretical constructs, but entire models for trying to express how using technology provides or creates so much quote unquote waste and uses so many more resources than less technologically dependent methods, that in itself is a liability. So I think that rather than just saying, do pessimists believe or not believe in technology, is that pessimists consider a lot of the methods to be fundamentally flawed and in fact creating more of a problem than a solution. So technological solutions to them are just more of the same, because if you look at what people like Rees and others are saying about the technological lifestyle, is that the inputs and the CO2 outputs that it generates are just not worth it, and they're not acceptable. Another example is nuclear technology. For all of those who would like to see fossil fuel-based technologies being replaced by something that's carbon neutral, the nuclear option is absolutely obvious. Everybody says, well, of course it doesn't. Yes, there are high startup costs, as there are, of course, to solar and to wind, but then that's a fairly long-term stable solution, and it's carbon neutral. Why aren't we doing that? Well, it's seen again as something that has bad long-term ecological
or a risk
consideration.
Consideration.
Exactly. Plus, it doesn't sell well because again, it allows us to live beyond our means, and it gets back to those. Frameworks that we discuss in one of our chapters, where in fact a lot of the framework's assumptions are that technology is bad because it impinges upon the land in ways that we would not impinge without the technology. So in a sense, it's a bit of a tautological argument.
Yeah, and what I would argue, I guess, one of the problems that we have with those people is that basically, if I was to summarize their take on things, if it's not renewable, it's not sustainable.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I don't want to jump ahead of other questions you might have here, but there is this assumption that technology is only good to the extent that it deals with renewable resources.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think ultimately our take and what we explain in the book is that humanity's track record as far as technological change goes is actually pretty good. No technology is perfect, but we tend to create lesser problems than those that existed over time. And if this is your criteria, then, I think humanity has done well. But a lot of the pessimists believe in something called the precautionary principle. And basically what they say is that we shouldn't go ahead in the absence of absolute certainty that we won't make things worse. But then, you could make the case, well, our ancestors should have never domesticated fire in the first place. But maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. I should.
No, I think we'll actually get there. So it's not too far ahead. I sort of want to wrap up the point about the pessimists. So they are obviously concerned about the planet being hurt by too much population, too many people.
Yes. And people consuming too many resources.
Yes.
So
right.
Basically their assumption is that it's not only the more of us there are, because populations are plateauing at the moment, but they're increasingly worried about increased standards of living. Mm-hmm. So lifting people out of poverty, they argue, might seem like, the charitable thing to do. But if we consider all the damage that this supposedly inflicts on the planet, from CO2 emission, from greenhouse gas emissions to increased resource consumption, then this is actually not something that is desirable or even sustainable in the long run. And this is where we strongly disagree with them. But
well, yes, and of course there is an underlying misanthropic assumption there in the pessimist perspective, in that, as many have summarized, I have a quote from Nordhaus about that I've previously gone into, but he also says, well, the assumption is that humans are greedy and selfish. Really? I mean, I think when we have seen over the centuries that when people are relatively free to innovate, and again, there is private property, there is a motive to innovate because they'll be rewarded, right? So there are incentives on many levels. People are immensely creative and immensely positive. So this idea that humans are just at base level greedy and selfish is so incredibly pervasive that it has led to people like Garrett Hardin, the patron saint of so many sustainability scholars, to be a super strong proponent. Well, he's dead now, but he was an extremely strong proponent of population control, essentially by any means necessary, including not helping people in poorer countries, because, well, what will they do? They'll just come and eat your resources. So why do you need more of them? I mean, some of the philosophical assumptions are so troubling and so anti-human that
there's a reason why we wrote the book. And what, if I may supplement what Joanna was saying here, is that what a lot of pessimists don't understand is that the profit motive through the processes that I've described earlier is sort of guiding humanity through an invisible end process to create more wealth while simultaneously reducing our environmental impact. And one thing that, again, the pessimists don't understand is that what has really allowed us to do that ultimately is that we've replaced resources that used to be harvested from the surface of the planets, whale for their oil. Let's say we would grow linseed or cotton or producing food rather inefficiently. We've replaced a lot of that by resources that we've extracted from below the ground. So minerals, but primarily, things like, fossil fuels, so coal, natural gas, petroleum. You look at our world today, we're born, we're surrounded by plastic. We live, we're surrounded by plastic. We die, we are surrounded by plastic. We might view that as a bad thing, but again, consider what plastic replaced. Wood, ivory, glass, tin, lead, maybe, lead pipes, what have you. And so this is one thing that the sort of would you call it emotional revulsion
Yeah,
to
well, because
fossil
it is.
fuels by
Yeah,
pessimists. This is what I think their main blinder in terms of understanding how humanity can both increase its number, improve its standards of living, while reducing its environmental impact. Again, replacing things that used to be produced on the surface of the planets by things that came from below the ground.
Well, yes, and you're absolutely right to call it an emotional revulsion. There is both a revulsion against people, let's say, having more people. But why is it so strong? Because they'll be consuming these things. Now, if we truly look at what the fossil fuel revolution and what human ingenuity has brought us forth from these fossil fuels, we can see that yes, in fact, we have lightened the burden on a lot of animal species, and in developing economies, land is rewilding. And some species are rebounding. Actually, recently, the science journalist, scientist, and a peer, British peer, Matt Ridley, had a really interesting interview in which he said that not only is the earth greening as a result of the increased carbon dioxide concentration, which is sometimes mentioned but not very widely. But that's a fantastic thing. Plants actually evolved in an atmosphere that had higher CO2 levels than today's atmosphere. So plants are becoming more efficient. But what Ridley added is that we're actually adding species. Yes, there are definitely species that are declining, and some may be on the brink of extinction. In fact, we know of several. But first of all, there are huge numbers of species that have not been documented. And of the ones we know and can count in various environments, we're actually getting new ones. He mentioned a number of birds, some of them urban, semi-urban, and suburban birds that have been added to the count of species. There is a kind of sparrow that's been added. And he said, why aren't we rejoicing at the fact that now we have one more sparrow, at least in British urban environments, and several other birds in these liminal environments that overlap urban and countryside environments. Why? Well, it's because these are not what we see as flagship species of nature. So many environmentalists and sustainability activists, their discourse is about just the wild species. But no, we are actually allowing and shepherding many other species to thrive in mixed or urban environments, and there are more species. So again, this is the unsung side benefit of a lot of what we've been doing. We've been making the earth more, how shall we put it, in many places wilder, more hospitable, and just
but also more diverse.
Yes,
human intervention. We brought species to places like New Zealand. They might have lost 2 or 3, but New Zealand now has much more diverse flora and fauna than the past. You build a road in the wood, well, you create a zone in which flowers would grow that they wouldn't grow otherwise. So I guess what we're trying to say is that yes, there's more of us. We're wealthier. We're having an impact on the planet. But it's not the sort of, bulldozed, paved over, gray, soil contamination landscape that a lot of the pessimists were predicting.
It doesn't fit that narrative. The problem is that a lot of the pessimists also have, they use a lot of motivated reasoning to maintain us in this state of horror and moral revulsion. But the truth is, nothing's as black and white. Nothing's as extreme as what they're offering us, and what they're not willing to see. And this is one thing where they're completely inconsistent about, is they want the earth to be saved as a certain vision of the earth, as was, let's say, sold by David Attenborough in his 1995 series or something like that. This particular pristine kind of earth, but it's changing. The earth is incredibly dynamic. It changed before humans became one of the dominant species. There were mass efflorescences of life and mass extinctions many times before people. And to have the audacity to think that the Earth circa 2019 is the only Earth that's worth preserving, given the biases of the people who see it that way, is absolutely it's even inconsistent with their own biases. Why fix the earth into some kind of an anthropocentric bias? Apparently the people who advocate that don't understand that they're applying their own bias to that.
I don't want to simplify everything you guys just said too much, but it sounds to me that what I'm pulling out of this is, in your views, the pessimists, although of course they are right to observe the costs that technology or progress would have, they downplay the benefits and what else it can do. That is to say, they might exaggerate the costs and focus too much on those, but they're not willing to acknowledge the benefits.
And they often misdiagnose the problem, because for them, everything ultimately is about overpopulation, about new technology. But if you look at places where species are really threatened, well, it's often in poor economies. If you cannot go buy your food at the grocery store, well, you're going to go kill some apes or, poach whatever is available on the land, or else if you don't fish farm, if you don't have fishes producing in fish ponds, well, you go out in the open sea, and then the problem is, the tragedy of open access. It's not necessarily because people are wealthier, but what you see, for example, is that in the last few decades, the percentage of the fishes and the seafood generally that we find in our supermarket is now coming predominantly from, let's call them, farmed environments, ponds or, big nets that you move around in the ocean for certain variety of tunas. You see that the forest cover in the United States, for example, has been expanding for a century. Well, what has happened between that? Well, in 1920 in the US, we had roughly 100 million people. Today, you've got well over 300 million. Almost everyone above the age of 16 in the United States today has a car. That was not the case in the 1920s. But what has happened is that we produce so much more food on a reduced amount of land than in the past, that a lot of marginal agricultural lands all over North America have been abandoned. A lot of land, for example, that was devoted to tobacco production in the United States has reverted back to forest. Much of Appalachia today is forested, but when you still have people who were practicing a quasi-subsistence farming lifestyle over a century ago, well, they were keeping livestock, or they were trying to grow spinach or whatever you could hope to grow in Appalachia. But today, a lot of people have left the countryside. They've moved to the city. We produce something like 5, 6, 7 times more corn on the same piece of land, on the best land, than we did a century ago. So people just abandon marginal land. And as a result, yes, you have a lot more people in North America. You have a lot more cars. We have a lot more stuff than we did a century ago. And yet we also have a lot more forest cover. I mean, even in a jurisdiction like Ontario, we're actually losing more farmland to the forest than we are losing to suburban sprawl. Now, granted, people will say, well, we're losing marginal land where the Canadian Shield is or whatever. That's true, but still, overall, I believe that on that balance, more people, more wealth, actually we found ways to lighten the burden of humans on the landscape.
Yes, and even use some of these lands that are rewilding or reverting back to nature as for ecotourism, and some of the, let's say, more marginal farming areas, and for some agritourism. So it's overall the use of land is more diversified. Species are being created. Species are coming back, and definitely I think there is not just an exaggeration by the pessimists, but also a certain distortion. And that's also,
they want things to be bad, it's
they do. They want things to be bad, so that I think it justifies not just the discourse's outlook, but certain of the prescriptions that come with it.
And it's also, again, I don't want to assume too much in terms of people's motive, but I think a lot of the problem with the pessimists is that if they don't see someone in charge, they don't believe that good things can happen. If you leave it to markets, to the price system, to people spontaneously innovating without a grand master plan, somehow I think it just doesn't compute with the number of people.
But again, it's difficult to really speculate what drives people, although there is certainly, as some have suggested, including, let's see, who wrote about the Iron Triangle there?
Yes,
Bailey. That's right. People like Ron Bailey have suggested, well, there are monetary reasons behind in fact, a lot of these views. Well, there's a lot of evidence also in the land of scholarly publication that there are other reasons: prestige, grant money, and rampant publication biases that dictate certain views getting a lot more exposure and getting published more than others. But overall,
But you also have the old joke about, what's an environmentalist? Well, it's the first one that built a cabin by the lake, just doesn't want anybody else
Yes,
to
exactly.
go there.
Well, exactly, and doesn't want anybody else to go there.
So, you look at Dan Turner. I mean, I guess our younger listeners won't be familiar with him, but he's one of those billionaire, created CNN, was all over, gave a lot of money to population control activities. And his philosophy is very simple. We have an environmental problem because we have too many people who have too much stuff. But at one point in time, he was the biggest private landowner in the United States, and he was, buying land, and he was trying to bring back the bison population. But he just basically did not want too many people on his property, I think, or didn't want too many neighbors.
Many pessimists, many of the British pessimists, if they were not outright patricians or lords and other hereditary nobility, they certainly held similar views. Now, also another thing, since we're trying to wrap up this pessimist discourse overview, is that one thing that Pierre and I tried to make clear in the book is that the two narratives or the two discourses, the optimist and pessimist, do not really overlap. Political distinctions such as left and right. If you look at people who have written on both sides, you'll see that there are as many Marxists as there are social conservatives. On the pessimist, on the optimist and pessimist sides, there really. You'll find figures from the church on the pro-population and figures from the church on the anti-population or pessimist side. I mean, people like Giovanni Botero were among the first pessimists or Malthusians, but you've had others writing on the other side. So again, the two discourses really straddle both political and religious divides. So you can't really say that those kinds of divisions are reproduced in these discourses. And interestingly, also, through our research, we've discovered that those who are strong proponents of anthropogenic climate change can also be found on both sides. So it's not just those who are proponents of climate change that are outright pessimists. We found one astrophysicist and astrobiologist, Adam Frank, who's absolutely a technological optimist to a really large degree, while at the same time believing that we are radically changing the climate and that we're affecting the Earth.
And we'll probably come back to that. This is actually, I think, a great time to take a quick break. So we'll be back in a sec. I'm speaking here with Pierre and Joanna on Is Overpopulation Hurting the Planet? The Curious Task is a podcast from the Institute for Liberal Studies. Feel free to send us questions and feedback to curioustask@liberalstudies.ca. A special thanks to our supporters on Patreon, including Peter Jaworski, Vincent Geloso, and Danny Leroy. Remember to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter at Curious Task ILS, and rate us on Apple Podcasts or wherever else you're listening to The Curious Task. Welcome back, everyone. I'm talking with Pierre and Joanna today. Before the break, guys, we talked about a lot, but what we did, I think, was create a great overview for anyone listening about really what the pessimist side of the equation is when it comes to a population of the planet. We were discussing the pessimist and optimist dichotomy, and we really went into what the pessimists think, what's driving them. We touched on a lot, but of course, one thread that kept coming up that we didn't really dive too much into was that ultimately, no matter where a pessimist is coming from, they view the population as sort of a problem in general. But putting aside global warming for a sec or climate change or whatever we want to talk about on that end of the discussion, but it always seems to come back to the fact that more humans means more problems.
Yeah, no, I think today we have a somewhat distorted vision of how the modern environmental movement rose in the United States and Western Europe. If you read about what happened there, well, you see people were worried about pesticides, river catching on fires, and DDT, things like that. But really, what I would argue is that it was ultimately population driven, and my reading of this, and that's the case I make in the book, and I think it's a fairly defensible one, is that Before the Second World War, you had a strong eugenics movement in all advanced economies. And for people who are not familiar with eugenics, the idea was that, well, if we can breed horses to have better horses, why can't we breed humans to have better humans? I know the poor, the stupid, the deficient people are multiplying too fast. And so, but of course, the ultimate conclusion of that was, an experiment in applied eugenics was Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen and other concentration camps in Germany and Eastern Europe. And so what happens at the end of the Second World War is that you've got all these people who've invested their lives in eugenics, they have their organizations, but somehow the Nazi experiment has made them very unpalatable. And what happens is that a few of them then see the rise of DDT, see the rise of other ways of dealing with tropical diseases, and they reinvent themselves as those population catastrophists. They're like, well, what's the point of going on a tropical island, saving the lives of people in the short run, when because they will eventually run out of resources, they will eventually die of famine.
A good example is Aldous Huxley. Aldous Huxley wrote famously that why should we glorify the fact that, let's say, 20,000 lives were gained by spraying DDT and killing the malaria mosquito, if those 20,000 people will then go on to have 100,000 people in the next generation, and all of them will painfully and slowly starve to death. And another person who advocated very strongly for both population control and a complete cutting off of aid to developing nations was Garrett Hardin. He's venerated for, of course, the tragedy of the Commons. But what people don't realize very often, that was one of many articles in a series of his, culminating in his Lifeboat Ethics article of 1974, in which he used this metaphor of every nation being every well-developed or every rich nation being essentially a boat, and the population being contained within it. And then the poorer nations who are struggling to keep up and who are struggling to feed their burgeoning population are swimmers in the ocean. And what these swimmers are trying to do is they're trying to get into the lifeboats so that the quote-unquote rich nations can take on these extra travelers and save them from drowning. Well, Hardin's argument was, why take them on? Why accept them on the lifeboats? We can only take care of our own people. Get rid of them.
And so what happened? You could say, well, that's an intellectual argument, but what happened is that there were very real policy consequences to that in the 60s and the 70s. So some people might be familiar with the Chinese one-child population, which was sort of a policy, which was abolished 2 or 3 years ago. But some people don't realize that when India experienced food shortage in the 60s, the Lyndon Johnson administration insisted that they practice population control or that they implement sterilization policies.
And this was forced sterilization.
And this was forced sterilization. So, of course, what happened in the context of a society like India is that it was all the untouchables or, people at the bottom order of the caste system that were forcibly sterilized. And, millions of people went through that. And there was a lot of human suffering associated with population control in the 60s and 70s. It was not just an intellectual exercise. And that's why eventually those policies became unpalatable as they became better known. And this is why I would argue, from the 1990s to maybe, 2007, 8, 9, population control was not something that you would discuss in polite company. But then it was sort of revived within the context of climate change policy. But I don't know if you want to add something else before we jump into that.
Well, in terms of real life outcomes that were created by these forced sterilizations on huge masses of people, we had mass infanticide and gender imbalances in countries like China and India. That are fairly significant right now. So yeah, it's mass suffering that keeps on being perpetuated over many generations.
And what you guys were saying is that the proponents of population control, they aren't just talking about population control in and of itself. They often come, the backdrop to their thought process is that the planet or that area or whatever it may be can't handle the population. That's often the reasoning that's given?
Well, and the thing is that if you believe that too many people are ultimately a problem, then you have no choice but to adopt drastic and authoritarian policies. You cannot just wait for people to become wealthier and have less children. I mean, that's another issue that the pessimists never really believe in. What you observe historically is that in poor societies, people tend to have more children. Why? Well, because they don't have pension funds. So you hope that if you have 10 children, a few will survive and perhaps one will turn out to be a good kid and will take care of you. But also when you practice subsistence agriculture, kids are a good return on investment fairly quickly. They can pick up weeds, they can keep the livestock, what have you. As societies develop, children become much more of a financial burden. And, especially these days, you've got to pay for them until their mid to late 20s or what have you. So there is a strong incentive to have less children. But you see, the pessimists never really buy into that or believe that it will never be fast enough or sufficiently scalable.
And I think the other aspect there is that they don't want to make it dependent on the person. So they don't want they don't want to leave it to people as a matter of choice or as a matter of this economic imperative. They want to make it a political imperative. They want to, in fact, they want to coerce people into that. So it becomes population control at that scale is a matter of mass coercion.
Yeah, and what's interesting about China is that, historically they were old-fashioned Marxists, and Mao, for example, did not believe in overpopulation. Mm-hmm. He came from a classical background, but obviously by the 60s you have the Great Leap Forward, and they realized that whatever they tried to do as orthodox Marxists, nothing works. And then, one Chinese policymaker ran into the Club of Rome and limits to growth and brought that back to China, and they bought into this. So Cuba also did that eventually. They switched from the traditional technological optimist position when confronted by the unavoidable, indubitable failure of their system. They switched to force population, to coerce population policies.
And in fact, as the realities of the demographic transition are becoming more and more obvious, so as world leaders everywhere are starting to see that in most countries, not every country, for example, Kenya is definitely still growing, but in many industrialized and industrializing countries, the fertility, the replacement rate, which is 2.1 children per woman, has already been, let's say,
has collapsed.
Yeah, well, it's collapsed for some countries by decades. So most countries in Europe have a total fertility rate of like 1.5, 1.7 or so. Actually, Canada is around 1.67 or so. So apparently, it's actually on the higher end of fertility rates for developed countries. But the point is that as this is happening and as fertility becomes below replacement in many countries, including Brazil, what then people who are still advocating population control are saying, but consumption. So these days, the activists that advocate population control always bring together the issue of consumption, the increased consumption and the increased waste that additional population will produce.
Poor people want to have cars and eat steak. We can't let that happen.
Absolutely. So as it becomes well known that the population growth rate will peak and will start declining. So that doesn't mean the total number of people, because that will keep on growing probably well until
for a few decades.
Yeah. Well, yeah, so till the end of this century for sure. But as that happens, and why does that happen? Because the people who are in the pipeline, so to speak, so the people who are alive on Earth, tend to now live a lot longer than they used to, right? So everybody alive now has a much higher chance of making it past, let's say, 35 or 36, into their 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, even in the developing countries. So the people alive now will be alive for a lot longer than people used to be historically. So even as fewer and fewer babies join, these people still alive are making this large chunk of humanity in the pipeline last for a whole lot longer, right? So the concern right now is that people we have alive right now are going to stay alive for a long time and are going to consume.
So we've discussed a lot about how the pessimists feel about all these issues. For the last sort of section of our conversation, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the optimists, and I'd like to start it with a challenge. Although look, we've discussed the pessimist and optimist dichotomy, but someone may turn around to both of you and say, well, you may have a point about the pessimists, but is it possible that the optimists are too optimistic? We talked about sometimes that the pessimists will overestimate and over exaggerate the problems with technological progress and ultimately population growth, but do the optimists put too much faith in that?
Well, I would argue that it's actually the contrary. If nothing else, the optimists have been too cautious. I mean, if you look at the way we've slashed world poverty in the last 2 decades, granted, a lot of that is driven by China, but China is 1 point whatever billion people, and India. The number of people, the percentage of the world's population living in absolute poverty or in, let's say, dire poverty is lower than it's ever been. And these rates, the poverty rate came down a lot faster than even most optimist people had predicted. And basically, all you needed to do was to introduce market reforms in places like China and India. So if you read Julian Simon, what he was saying is that if you look at the historical trends, things tend to get better over time, but geometrically, to speak like Malthus. If nothing else, again, the more technology we have, the more we can invent. If we're able somehow to liberalize trade, if we allow people to, adopt the latest technology, a poor economy today that wants to catch up to the advanced economies has much easier access to technological change and much better technologies than was the case 30, 40 years ago. So raising humanity's living standard, paradoxically, is getting a lot easier as we become wealthier and we have more technologies. So no, I would argue that if nothing else, the optimists have been too cautious.
Absolutely. So 2 notes to that. I completely agree with that. One good illustration of that is how many developing countries in Africa, for example, are skipping the step of having large infrastructures built, especially for telecommunications. So with cell phones being ubiquitous, these countries have saved a ton of time and energy and money by having to invest into heavy metal wood infrastructure of not so much electrifying, but
Copper,
I guess, yes, exactly, definitely. And copper is very expensive. So they've been able to save time and money and leapfrog through that step altogether. And that really helps with innovation and it helps with growth. Another good example was to come back to the Matt Ridley article I mentioned earlier, how little thought went into the positive sides of, let's say, some of the industrial outputs that people like Bill Rees like to decry as the horrors of the technological civilization. So CO2 output, well, creates a ton of greening around the world. There have been tremendous positive outcomes, and I think there are more to come.
So if I'm clear on what you guys are saying, and actually maybe I should back up and say a lot of people may listen to a discussion like this and think ultimately what you guys are trying to say is population, it's okay if it increases because there'll be technological progress, and some people might think that you guys are saying but the climate change, and we're not going to get into that too much detail here, we don't have enough time for that, but climate change, pollution, harm to the earth, that's not what you guys are concerned about. But if I'm listening to you correctly, what I'm hearing is that you're saying that it's market activity and it is in fact this technological progress that actually leads to treating the planet better. And I believe there was a graph in your book where it on the one axis it had time, on the other axis, and I believe it was tracing basically pollution, and it said that as technological progress starts, there may be a spike or an increase in harm to the planet, but as it continues, there's actually a decrease in harm to the planet. And I think that's what you guys are talking about right now.
Let's look, for example, at any advanced economies. So we're podcasting this from Toronto. This is where we're based. So around 1900, you might have had maybe 500,000 people in the greater Toronto area. Today, it's 10 times that. But at the same time, the air quality in Toronto is much better than it was then. We don't have the public health problems that people had in the past. Well, what would you have seen if somehow you're able to travel back in time to 1900? Well, there are two things. There are other problems with two things. First of all, people are burning coal to cook their food, to keep their houses warm, and it's a very polluting technology. You have a lot of particulates that come out of chimneys, you have soot, you have other issues like that, and you don't have cars. So you have a lot of horses, and the city is drowning in horse manure and urine. And so, of course, people cannot invest in a modern sewage system. So the quality of water in Lake Ontario and the streams around the city is really horrible by today's standard. It's even worse than what you would observe in developing countries today. I mean, air quality in Toronto, I mean, we don't have really good numbers, but we can approximate. And I have no doubt that air quality in Toronto in 1900 was worse than it is in Beijing today. But what happens again in the meantime? Well, population grows by 10, people are a lot wealthier than in the past, and yet our environment is cleaner because, well, we've switched to natural gas, we've switched to hydroelectricity, we can afford to build a sewage treatment plant, we can invest in nuclear. A car doesn't get sick, it does not urinate, it does not defecate.
It doesn't attract flies, right? So it avoids a lot of these, let's say, quote-unquote, insect-borne, well, plagues, insect-borne diseases. And also there are fewer ways for rats, vectors of illness, to move and snack on various diseased organisms and things like that.
And what we argue is that this improvement in environmental quality was conditional upon a growing population, which made possible the development of new technologies and less environmentally or
and this is key because that means if with more people, there was more scope for division of labor and for the ability for people to specialize at something that they were truly mind-blowingly good at, so that they could do this really well and others could buy it. And then this way, only the people who are really good at something actually get to do it. And everybody gets to do something productive and trade with everybody else, right? Yes. You can't do that in a community that's devoted to subsistence agriculture.
And at the same time, there is a little caveat here. Our air is not cleaner because we've shipped our dirty industry to less advanced economies. If nothing else, we produce more than in the past. We just employ a lot less people and producing stuff than we did in the past, but we do produce more. And again, as less advanced economies develop and benefit from technology transfers from less advanced economies, they will go through the same stages. The problem we have in China right now is that, of course, it's a communist dictatorship. So all sorts of bad things will happen. They will not necessarily enforce the law against the polluters, or there's a lot of corruption going on. I would argue that the pollution problem in China is made worse because of their bad institutions, but I'm still confident that over time, as you have more of a middle class, as people get more of a say, you will have reaction against pollutions. And environmental problems are in the end rich people's problem. When you don't know where your next meal will come from, you don't really worry about the sewage. You need a certain level of you need a certain standard of living before you begin to worry about, let's call them secondary environmental problems. But what we've seen historically, as economies develop, they become more populated, but also environmentally cleaner.
And I think that level is somewhere between $3,000 and $4,000 a year in earnings per person. So we're not talking about huge amounts of wealth. We're not talking about somebody having, let's say, a minimum wage job in an advanced economy. We're talking about mere thousands per year. Per person, in order to be able to start seeing serious amelioration of every environmental indicator around. So again, we're talking about us reaching that level in more and more countries, and that's well illustrated by people like Steven Pinker and by the Roslings, Hans Rosling's posthumous book written with his daughter and I think her husband. And the interesting thing that happened to the Roslings after the book came out and it was reviewed was one of the reviewers was absolutely flabbergasted at Rosling's reply when he was asked what he believes about population and overpopulation. And Rosling actually said, this was an interview he did shortly before he died when he was still writing the book. The interviewer asked him, what do you think about overpopulation? He says, that is not a problem. Population and reproduction should be a personal choice. People will choose according to what's happening in their lives, whether they're economically and socially able to have another child. And this idea of this the voluntary choice to reproduce so shocked the interviewer that in all this, people like Rosling and people like Pinker and many others. I mean, even if you go back to the writings of Bjorn Lomborg, what they do see is this rising trajectory for improvement, and that to many of them, not just to us, shows that these population decisions are again going to shift towards more voluntary economic choices and again social choices.
And when it comes to social choices too, I find it interesting, Pierre, that you did say before that pollution and damage to the planet, that's ultimately, you said, like it's a rich or wealthy people's nations ultimately a problem. This is when people can start worrying about these things. I was going to say that it is interesting to note that most people's preferences are towards non-pollution. Now people are making more conscious choices when they do have the income and the lifestyle that enables them to be concerned about these things. Most people, I think you could say, if you talk to them about would they rather purchase a product that damages the planet or not, that they would choose the not part. So I found it very interesting that you mentioned that as well.
Yeah, although unfortunately there's a lot of misinformation about the real problems that we should tackle, but that's for another day.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we'll have you guys back on that one.
Okay.
Thanks. And if I can pitch Pierre's other work, another thing he mentioned today in the book as well is that pollution, well, what we see as pollution can be a treasure as well. People over the centuries, and especially in the last several decades, have made fantastically successful businesses out of reclaiming various pollutants that were seen as absolutely deadly at certain times. That applies to both fossil fuels and a variety of other resources. So again, pollution, just as resources, can be, well, relative.
So you were both ultimately saying that more economic activity ends up actually reducing the environmental impact. That's what we just explored. And that might be hard for people to wrap their heads around, right? Because they think if they see pollution, that's the result of some activity. If you have more activity, then there's more pollution.
Well, the problem that people have, especially when they look at it historically, is that they see a few pictures of, let's say, how polluted the environment was in Victorian England, but they don't see the movie. And by the movie, I mean is that, yes, at first, some industry comes along and there's a lot of sulfur going up through the smokestack. But then somebody comes along and says, well, sulfur, well, we can turn that into sulfuric acid. It's used in a lot of industries. And so let's find a way to capture it and turn it into a valuable product. A lot of things were dumped into the rivers. Well, some people were like, okay, well, we can actually create dyes out of that stuff. There was a lot of agricultural waste in the past that could be turned eventually into, food for animals or fertilizer after a little treatment. And so, we mentioned, I've been working on that for a few decades, but we have a few pages on how these things spontaneously happen in market economies. Because ultimately, manufacturers buy their resources. Nobody gives them stuff for free. And it's always in their interest to try to extract as much value out of what they buy rather than just release it in the environment. But ultimately, what people don't understand is that it's not so much the amount of stuff that you handle, it's how you handle it. So in the 20th century, again, our younger listeners might not understand that. What you observed in the United States is that the people were becoming wealthier and the environment was becoming cleaner, whereas in the Soviet Union, under central planning, people were actually getting poorer and the environment was getting worse. And so it's ultimately not your level of wealth, it's how much or how little you release stuff in the environment that really matters, which would probably get us to CO2 emissions or greenhouse gas emissions.
Well, yes. So how much you release, and also, do you allow people to do something with it, right?
Yes.
Do they have a choice to turn it into something?
Or do they have an incentive?
Absolutely, and the incentives are key. We wrote a paper about turning cotton seeds from an absolute menace, environmental menace, into a host of byproducts. So just to pitch another thing.
Yes.
When we began this section of the conversation, we were ultimately talking about what the solution is, and if I'm hearing you guys correctly, the solution is ultimately in a market-based economy to let that work, so people discover the incentives and work through the incentives that essentially make them produce and create more efficient and more planet-friendly technologies. Is that a fair way to round it off, or is that too much of a simplification?
What we argue is that ultimately market economies hate waste And pollution is ultimately waste. And so what happens over time is that the best firms are those that create the most value out of their inputs, and the most wasteful are the ones that are least able to create value out of their inputs. In a market economy, the less efficient firms go out of business, the more creative, the more efficient firms grow and prosper. And so over time, you create more wealth while releasing less stuff in the environment. And all you need for that is the profit motive, and also holding people responsible for what they emit in the environment, so either through property rights or other mechanism. But again, this might be for another show.
So it's important to remember that pollution and harm to the planet is not just it's not linear. It's not just a straight line. It's often interrupted by technological progress.
Exactly.
Yeah, so
resource substitution, so replacing coal with natural gas, hydroelectricity, and nuclear, for example. Or else, if you look at the history of the petroleum industry, at first, the only valuable fraction of the petroleum barrel was the one that was used to produce kerosene as a substitute for whale oil. But then what happened at first is that people were releasing gasoline into streams because they didn't know what to do with it. And then they realized, oh my God, we can use gasoline to power internal combustion engines. And so suddenly you have a technology, the car, which no matter how imperfect it was a century ago, was still better than horses that needed to be fed, that needed to be taken care of when they were sick, that would defecate and again urinate and stuff like that. So what we argue in the book is that in market economies, economic development, even though it's not necessarily what engineers or creative business people have in mind, tends to be greener over time because people tend to create lesser problems than those that existed before they came along. So what really motivates every creative engineer or technician is to fix problems. You know, is there a way to make this better? Is there a way to make things less useful? Can there be a business person will say, how can I create value out of that? And spontaneously, what happens is an economic system in which inputs are increasingly confined to the economic sphere and less released into the environment. The one exception is carbon dioxide as a result of burning fossil fuels.
So, Pierre and Joanna, we've talked about a lot here. I'd like to close off the conversation, bring it full circle, and try and put a finer point on all the things we've been talking about today. And I'd like each of you to take a turn at this. So, what do you hope are the main takeaways for someone listening to you guys here on whether or not population increase hurts the planet? If someone was to listen to a snippet of this conversation, what would each of you like to take away from it?
Well, we've had this debate for 200 years. For 200 years, the optimists, people who believe in human brains and human hands and market economies, for 200 years, optimists have been right. And we see no indication that things are getting worse. What we hear these days are computer model scenarios of doom. But the actual evidence shows that humanity has been good at creating lesser problems than those that existed before.
Joanna?
That's an absolutely great beginning. I would say that the main lesson is not to despair, because humanity has been actually looking at these problems for more than 200 years. These problems, the problems of the two discourses, the pessimists seeing doom in almost every new development, and the optimists rallying and thinking we can get past it, are as old as civilization. They go back to Aristotle, they go back to medieval thinkers. We found an Islamic thinker in the 11th century who was a pessimist. So this is not just us. We've always had this. Some of those views go back to how we're wired. If you look at what psychologists and anthropologists have been writing about people, we have a Stone Age brain. We tend to have this fight or flight response to a lot of problems. The key is not to give in to the superficial evidence, to actually analyze problems deeply and allow institutions that have been proven to allow humans to develop past, let's say, the hunter-gatherer and grazing stage to reign. I think that is a big lesson.
Yeah, so don't panic, kids. There will still be a planet in 12 years from now. And don't believe that you should not have children because we're imposing a unseeming burden on the planet.
Yes.
People were saying that 20 years ago. People were saying that 40 years ago. People were saying that 100 years ago. People were saying that 200 years ago. Heck, you could even see the whole flood episode in the Bible as God being angry at humans.
The Epic of Gilgamesh as well. So this is the narrative of perdition and annihilation is as old as humanity. But along with that is the Promethean myth, which is actually our beautiful reality. That is the truth. People are able to turn their minds, their brains, their inventiveness to truly benefit themselves and the planet. And the point is, as soon as they've benefited themselves and their closest environment, they're already working to benefit towards benefiting the planet. That's the implied outcome of what they're doing.
Things will be fine if we don't turn our back on technological advances and our belief in progress.
Great. I think that is an excellent place to end it. Pierre and Joanna, thank you so much for talking with me today.
Thank you, Alex. It was a pleasure.
This episode of The Curious Task was produced by Alex Aragona and Sabine L. Chidiak. Our executive producer is Matt Buffton. The music you hear on the podcast is by Lindy Voppenfjord. You should check out his other stuff online. The Curious Task exists today because of donations of time and money from those creating it and listeners like yourself. Check us out on Patreon and find out how you can support us and get access to exclusive offers. I'm Alex Aragona. Thank you very much for joining us on The Curious Task.